Tonight, back into lockdown for millions of Victorians, with the Premier saying he had no choice but to act.
I know how inconvenient this is, but it's nothing compared to having this virus run through your community or your district. We're doing everything we can to stop that.
The New South Wales Premier warns there's still a long way to go in the outbreak after recording 65 new COVID cases. Changes proposed to the federal relief payments for all areas affected by lockdowns. And a Tasmanian author takes home Australia's most coveted literary prize. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Kirsten Aiken. In just under 5 hours, the whole state of Victoria will be back in lockdown for the next 5 days. The trigger point was the discovery that at least 3 people caught the virus at the footy at the MCG on Saturday. Late this afternoon, the Premier, Daniel Andrews, said there was no other choice. And in a veiled swipe at New South Wales, he said now is not the time for dawdling. From midnight, Victorians will go into lockdown number 5 until 11:59 p.m. next Tuesday night. The state will revert to the same settings as last month's lockdown. It's expected schools will switch to remote learning from Monday. Regional areas not affected by the outbreak may get a reprieve, with the Premier promising to lift restrictions in those areas as soon as it is safe to do so.
Here we go again.
The Chief Health Officer and the Public Health team have recommended to me and my Cabinet colleagues that we lock Victoria down.
The 5-kilometre radius is back and there are only 5 reasons to leave your home as Victoria enters its 5th lockdown.
These cases started in New South Wales, but I'm determined that they'll end here because we will put this out with the help of every single Victorian.
The rules are the same as last month's lockdown. Retail is closed and online learning is back.
If you were authorised to work then, you will be authorised to work now. If you were closed then, you will be closed now.
The strict measures enforced after transmission between strangers at the MCG.
The fact of the matter is that it is moving so fast and it's so infectious.
A man in his 60s who lives at the Ariel Apartments in Maribyrnong is believed to be the source of 3 other infections in the MCC members reserve at the Carlton-Geelong AFL match on Saturday night. They weren't sitting together.
Struck it pretty well. Yeah, loves it. You cannot strike it any better than that.
MCC members have been urged to get tested.
Whatever you're doing at the moment, stop doing it. Please come and get tested so we can get that information and get you safe and secure.
One of those cases is a grade 4 student at St Patrick's Primary School in Murrumbina in Melbourne's southeast. The school was the 3rd to close in the past 24 hours and all students have been ordered to get tested.
People know in Victoria more than any other part of the country, 5 days of pain is much better than 5 weeks or 5 months.
There are now 18 cases in total linked to the removalists and family from New South Wales. In the past 72 hours, contact tracers have identified more than 70 exposure sites and 6,500 close contacts are in isolation.
But as fast as they're moving, they're just keeping pace with this virus. They're not getting in front of it.
And Victorians have responded quickly too, with huge lines at testing sites across the state.
Victorian businesses again suffer at the hands of the virus being carried in from another state.
The state opposition says lockdowns should be a last resort and the government's pulled the trigger early.
We can't keep living like this. We can't keep going into lockdown every time we get 10 or 12 cases in the community.
Masks are once again mandatory indoors and outdoors, and there's a good reason why. One man who spent 5 hours with the removalists who sparked this outbreak was wearing a mask and is yet to catch the virus. His neighbours who weren't wearing masks have tested positive. Bridget Rollison, ABC News, Melbourne.
We will have more from Victoria for you throughout the evening. Meanwhile, in Sydney, the lockdown is continuing, with the New South Wales Premier urging residents to stay the course. The numbers appear to be stabilising. There are 65 new COVID cases, a significant fall on the last few days, but today's worrying figure is 35. This is how many people were infectious in the community. Gladys Berejiklian says there's still the risk the Delta strain will take off. We begin with Kathleen Calderwood in southwest Sydney.
بس أكيد لو كنت هلا أنا أخذ الفاكسين يمكن ما كنت هون.
A cautionary tale from the COVID ward. Khalid Al-Masri is a father of 4 aged in his 40s. Pondering how this could have been prevented.
صعب كثير. أنا صار لي كم يوم هلا شوي رجعت عم بقدر أحكي نفسي رجع شوي.
GP Jamal Rifi published the video with permission. It's spoken in Arabic to get the message out to his local community.
We had about 9,000 people who watched that video, and I had numerous phone calls from community members inquiring how they can get a booking for the vaccination.
But worrying authorities is that people with COVID symptoms are going to their doctors or pharmacies.
If you're worried about your health condition and have symptoms, please call a health clinic, your GP or somebody on the phone. Do not present yourself to a pharmacist or a medical centre or a GP clinic.
This chemist at Wetherill Park has been deep cleaned multiple times.
We've been having to isolate staff, have new teams come on board, have them test through the testing sites at the moment just to keep everybody safe.
Infections are taking place in hospitals too. Some staff from Liverpool Hospital have been forced into isolation, and a nurse from Westmead's COVID ward caught the virus despite wearing protective gear.
That Westmead nurse was fully vaccinated and didn't have any symptoms. We know the vaccines are highly effective in protecting against severe disease.
Liverpool Ambulance Station is being deep cleaned after 3 paramedics caught the virus. One was already in isolation after coming into contact with a COVID positive patient. Staff have been told they can continue working as normal until they're advised on whether they're considered a close or casual contact. Kathleen Calderwood, ABC News, Sydney.
Let's go live to Cayman Gock at Roselle in Sydney's inner west. Cayman, there are concerns about the virus spreading at workplaces.
Well, Kirsten, one of those workplaces is WestConnex, where tonight we can confirm 3 delivery drivers who were supplying materials for the project have tested positive. Now, this, of course, is an enormous project with tentacles right across Sydney. It's unclear if these cases are linked to a Greenacre cluster where 4 employees from Hanson have been diagnosed, plus 9 workers at a neighbouring asphalt business. Now, the Transport Workers Union is furious. It says a truck driver alerted Hanson that he was positive with the virus as early as Saturday, but the company didn't inform other staff up until today, when New South Wales Health shut down the worksite. Take a listen.
I think they were putting profit before safety. They were very much concerned about losing their contract with Transurban WestConnect. I mean, this is outrageous.
Now, Hanson strongly disputes this. It says it was first alerted to the positive case on Tuesday, where contact tracing began immediately, and it is cooperating with authorities. Kirsten?
Cayman, you've got details also on a COVID scare at a nursing home in Western Sydney.
Yeah, Kirsten, a cleaner has tested positive at the Minchinbury Manor in Rooty Hill. Now, the aged care home has gone into lockdown as a precaution. We're told that about 90% of its 130 residents are fully vaccinated, but all staff and residents will be swabbed daily. As for the cleaner and 5 close contacts at the Minchinbury, they are all now self-isolating. Kirsten?
Cayman Gock reporting.
The Premier's increasingly feeling...
The New South Wales Premier is coming under increasing pressure for not declaring who exactly are essential workers. Her daily media conference was tense today. At one point, Gladys Berejiklian pleaded with reporters to stop shouting at her. The Premier says her government is far from perfect, but insists it is following health advice. Here's state political reporter Ashley Raper.
The Premier's increasingly feeling the heat over the decisions made so far.
The settings we have in place are having an impact. The settings in place are having an impact.
The cases of COVID-19 aren't increasing exponentially, but the number of cases that have been infectious in the community is remaining consistently high. That number needs to be 0 or close to it for the lockdown to end. And at this stage, the government maintains restrictions don't need to be tightened to help achieve it.
We rely on the best health advice available.
What is the health advice that is saying that these settings are right?
So clearly we're wanting to further decrease mobility and interactions.
The focus seems to be not on strengthening the stay-at-home orders, but on ensuring compliance.
I'm just going to emphasise to the employers throughout New South Wales, please understand there actually is a health order requiring you to allow your workers to work from home unless they really can't.
The retail and construction sectors can keep operating, even though the virus has spread as a result.
Why won't you set an example by ceasing work on some of your own infrastructure projects?
Can I say the following in relation to that? And that is that we know that those organisations that are continuing work are doing so in a COVID-safe way.
And the government is continuing to refuse to define what it considers essential work.
Why not tighten that, though? The Victoria did it very successfully, and you're saying we...
No, they didn't.
When pressed on the success of New South Wales's model...
Sorry, one question at a time. I'll get to all of them. It's not really nice being shouted at.
The Premier made a concession of sorts.
I'm not pretending this is easy. I'm not pretending that there's perfection in the settings. There never will be, no matter where you draw the line.
It's a fine line to walk when lives and livelihoods are at stake. Ashley Raper, ABC News, Sydney.
Let's return to our top story, Victoria's fifth lockdown of the pandemic. Victorian State political reporter Richard Willingham joins me now. Rich, the Premier used the term short and sharp a few times during his late afternoon press conference. Is this a case of 5 days or at least 5 days?
It's the big question. I think the strategy right now in Victoria is trying to basically avoid what's happening in Sydney. They want to be able to strike now. The Premier did concede, however, today that this he couldn't guarantee it would only be 5 days. And just last month we had our fourth lockdown. That was meant to be a circuit breaker for 7 days. It ended up being 14 with quite a long tail of restrictions. He says that this is going to keep happening. Lockdowns are going to be keeping an issue if vaccination rates aren't higher, and until that happens. But of course, the big question is this a sustainable policy and strategy to keep locking down every time there's an outbreak, given the impact on mental health and, of course, on the business community?
Richard, it is really interesting to see 2 lockdowns in 2 separate states. Do you think there'll be a lot of people watching to see which approach is seen to be the best eventually, when hopefully both of the cases in each outbreak are mopped up?
I guess we've got a really sort of a live experiment right in front of us. We're living it, you know. Nearly 10 million people, I'm sure, are sort of living this experience of which one's going to work better. And I think, Victoria's striking at a different time. There's only about 20 cases. New South Wales, it's obviously seeded a lot longer. And I'm not an epidemiologist, but there's clearly 2 different strategies at play here. But I think really the strategy here is to avoid where Sydney is and avoid what happened here in Victoria last year by trying to strike early. But again, we just don't know how long it's going to take. I think it is interesting, though, that the Premier did note that if regional areas in the next couple of days come back sort of COVID-free, there's a few places they're concerned about close contacts, then they actually may be released earlier from this lockdown in the far-flung parts of the state. Now, the virus isn't just here in Melbourne. There is cases that we know about on the Bellarine Peninsula near Geelong at Barwon Heads, and there's a few exposure sites also in Geelong and in Bacchus Marsh and Ballon, which is just west of Melbourne. So it's not just contained to the city at the moment, but of course, going back to that point, we've got a really live experiment. And I think Melbourne will be hoping that their strategy can be effective and that we can go back to some sort of type of COVID normality as early as Wednesday next week.
And what is the sense you are getting in terms of whether Victorians are behind Daniel Andrews in this short, sharp, early lockdown?
Well, it's a really interesting question because Victorians have suffered more lockdowns than anyone else. This is our 5th. I feel like we've been talking about this so many times. But I think there is some people in the community, and probably people who have got a more secure job and probably are able to work from home, who have been quite supportive of this idea of locking down quickly, to use the Premier's word, a bit of short-term pain for long-term gain. I think people also see what's happening in Sydney and go, they really want to avoid that. They don't want a repeat of what happened in Melbourne last year, where we had 116 odd days of lockdown plus a tail after that. So there's some support, but there's also a lot of people, particularly small business owners and other people, who just think this is a sustainable strategy to lock down every time you have an outbreak of more than a dozen cases. I think a lot of people are acknowledging that this is spreading quickly, and I think the fact that this is spread at the MCG between people who aren't known to each other in an outdoor environment is what's really spurred on this action. But I think the next 5 days were really challenging for a lot of people. People are, of course, experienced at this, but the mental toll, it can be quite triggering for some people and for those businesses that are going to struggle once again.
Yeah. Okay, Richard Willingham in Melbourne, thank you. And with lockdowns continuing, the Prime Minister has once again increased the financial support being offered by the federal government. COVID disaster payments will be made even more accessible and paid earlier for any person locked down for more than a week and unable to work. Political editor Andrew Probyn explains.
12 million Australians will be in lockdown from midnight. Australia's two biggest cities and surrounds, so often rivals, united by a common hardship.
Rules that you think might be appropriate one time sometimes have to change.
Since JobKeeper ended in March, there have been several adjustments to federal financial support.
You adapt, you change, you update, you streamline, you make it more simple.
From now on, workers affected by a lockdown greater than 7 days will receive up to $600 a week, including the first week backdated. The liquid assets test is ditched altogether, and businesses will start receiving up to $10,000 a week after the first fortnight if their turnover falls by at least 30%, split 50-50 between the Commonwealth and the state, but administered by the federal government.
We have to set up rules that apply right across the country.
Scott Morrison will put the new plan to National Cabinet tomorrow, along with a proposal for the states and Commonwealth to equally split the cost of income support for lockdowns shorter than 7 days.
We expect that the Commonwealth Government will step up and help those people who need that help.
The new arrangements anticipate more lockdowns until the vaccination rate is much higher.
Until we get the population fully vaccinated, we do not get to the other side of COVID-19.
I imagine we'll be doing very well if we get to 70% of people wanting to be vaccinated.
The federal government knows a higher proportion of vaccination would give greater confidence, encouraging everyone to have at least one by year's end, the goal.
If you wanted one, you could have had one. So you've had a conscious decision about whether you've sought to protect yourself from what is a very virulent virus.
It wasn't long ago that the Prime Minister was commending Gladys Berejiklian's gold standard approach to avoiding lockdown in New South Wales. So today is significant because Scott Morrison has surrendered to the realisation that sometimes there's no option, given the speed with which the Delta strain can spread. And importantly, the PM's now prepared to share the cost of lockdowns from the start, long or short. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
With Australia's two biggest cities plunged into lockdown once again, there is more pain for business owners and the economy on the way. The latest jobs numbers saw the unemployment rate drop to its lowest level in a decade today. But economists say Australia's COVID recovery is set for a major shock.
Empty streets, shops and offices. The economic fallout of Sydney's lockdown is yet to be known, but it is going to hurt.
The impact will be quite acute.
The latest jobs figures don't cover the lockdown. That'll show up next month. But June's jobs data continued the recent good numbers. 29,000 jobs were created, nudging the unemployment rate down to 4.9%. But there is some devil in the detail. Melbourne's 2-week lockdown during May and June slashed the number of hours worked in Victoria, while underemployment in that state soared to 10%. Those numbers are likely to be a good yardstick for Sydney's lockdown.
It's also worth noting that Victoria was only locked down for 2 weeks and Sydney's lockdown will be going for probably around 6 to 8 weeks. So potentially the lockdown impact will be more acute in Sydney.
35% of Australia's GDP is generated from Sydney. Restricting its workforce will have a national impact.
We've estimated for each week that Sydney is in lockdown, it will cost the national economy around $700 million to $1 billion a week.
And with Melbourne now entering a snap lockdown, that hit is going to be even more severe.
We are by no means out of this pandemic. There is still a long way to go to secure our economic recovery.
The June jobs figures once again show Australia's economic resilience, but it's now facing another big test. With Australia's two largest cities in lockdown, future data like unemployment, business confidence and GDP could be about to flip. Perhaps the RBA's forecast to keep interest rates on hold for longer wasn't such a stretch. Rachel Papazoni, ABC News.
Papua New Guinea has detected its first case of the coronavirus Delta variant, a 65-year-old Filipino man who was captaining a cargo vessel travelling from Indonesia. The patient is in isolation in a Port Moresby private hospital after genomic sequencing confirmed he had the Delta variant. 6 other crew have tested positive for COVID, but it's not yet known if they have the Delta strain.
We'll continue to work and to do all we can to keep the strain under control and from spreading in our country.
Authorities fear low vaccination rates will leave the country vulnerable if the more infectious variant spreads. Indonesia has seen another huge spike in coronavirus cases, now surpassing India's daily infection numbers. Indonesia recorded more than 54,000 infections yesterday. Health officials fear the Delta variant is spreading beyond the islands of Java and Bali, where a partial lockdown remains in place. Indonesia correspondent Ann Barker reports.
It's become the grim soundtrack to the pandemic in Jakarta. Residents across the capital hear ambulance sirens blaring all day and night. Often it's volunteer drivers who respond to the emergency calls.
I definitely feel scared about getting infected, as all humans will have such feelings. But this is for humanity, and I'm doing this from my heart.
In full protective gear, 53-year-old Sunario heads out to pick up another COVID-19 patient and take him to a nearby hospital. Ambulance drivers say they can get up to 80 calls a day to transport those infected, but they can only deal with about 30 in the space of 24 hours. Since the latest surge in infections began last month, demand for ambulances has soared. Volunteers are working in addition to government hospital ambulances.
The spike in cases that happened here in Java Island and mostly in Jakarta can't be handled by the government alone. Support from the people and volunteers like us is also a must, and we can end the pandemic faster.
The highly contagious Delta variant has seen a surge in patient numbers across Jakarta and much of Java in recent weeks. Indonesia yesterday recorded another 54,000 cases, almost 10 times the caseload in early June. Daily deaths are around 1,000 a day, and health experts predict case numbers will continue to rise as the Delta variant spreads beyond Java and Bali to more and more Indonesian provinces. Ann Barker, ABC News.
The United States is to begin evacuating Afghan interpreters who worked with American forces by the end of the month. As Taliban fighters make a violent push to retake control of territory, there are fears Afghans who worked with the coalition will be targeted. The US hasn't disclosed how many interpreters will be relocated.
But it is safe to say that we are planning for a range of contingencies. We are moving as swiftly as we can in the processing.
The Australian government has defended delays in processing visas for interpreters, saying they need to make sure applicants haven't switched allegiances to the Taliban. The European Union has unveiled plans to ban the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles within 15 years as part of an ambitious strategy to tackle climate change. The so-called Green Deal aims to more than halve Europe's emissions this decade, with the end goal of net zero by 2050. It includes a new tax on air and shipping fuels and tariffs on manufacturers that import cement, steel and aluminium.
If we don't fix this, we'll be fighting wars over water and food.
The measures need approval by 27 member states and the European Parliament, a process that could take 2 years. Tasmanian author Amanda Lowry has won the nation's most prestigious literary prize, the Miles Franklin Award. The novelist won the $60,000 prize for her 8th book, The Labyrinth, which took 5 years to write. She is the second Tasmanian to win the Miles Franklin after two-time winner Christopher Koch.
The Miles Franklin's a very special award. It has a great tradition, and it's the big one.
Judges said the book, set in a fictional coastal town, is a profound meditation on creation and destruction. To finance now, and while the unemployment figures released today looked good, there is still some bad news rising. Here's Daniel Ziffer.
The future can look pretty uncertain. The past gives us clues. Today's employment figures don't include the New South Wales lockdown or the situations in Victoria and other states. But analysis of what did happen shows how the impact lingers. This is domestic growth. Victoria was turbocharged as it roared out of lockdown, but its economy is still catching up. US indices headed up after its central bank, the Fed, said it would continue a stimulus program. Our dollar still under 75 US cents. Our key indices fell, with market darling Afterpay shedding more value after cashed-up competitors announced their entry to the buy now, pay later space. Iron ore remains near record highs, but big news for our commodity exporters. The European Union's new carbon border adjustment mechanisms, the CBAMs, mean goods coming in will be subject to the EU's carbon price. Just saying those words in Australia is like breathing the name of the villain in Harry Potter, but we might essentially get one by doing nothing. The EU is the trendsetter for similar commitments from our biggest trading partners. Metals produced for export, like aluminium, the most exposed. And that's finance.
The much-loved ABC weather presenter Mike Bailey has been remembered as a funny and charismatic man. Just 10 mourners were allowed to farewell the 71-year-old at today's funeral in Sydney. Bailey was the trusted face of weather at the national broadcaster and Channel 7 for more than 2 decades. Off-screen, he was a dedicated family man.
There's nothing I loved more than my dad. His sense of humour, his charisma, his passion, his work ethic, love and support will be missed by all.
A public memorial will be held when COVID rules allow. Here's today's weather now, and Graham Creed.
We've got cloud, bursts of showers, some isolated thunderstorms with hail and snow starting to drop to low levels over the coming 48 hours through the southeastern states. Although, when I say that, it actually doesn't necessarily include Tasmania. The winds then are not expected to be as strong. And some of the coldest of the air will actually sweep through into Victoria and New South Wales. This is where we're expecting to see some of the snow down to the lowest levels. We've also got wild conditions through South Australia, some strong winds about the Eucla coast of Western Australia to begin with as we move through the day. But conditions in the west do begin to ease off, particularly as far as wind strengths go. Although we are still looking at the potential of a few showers about the west coast and also the south coast. But those showers will be widespread in South Australia, some thunderstorms with some hail. We've got gale force winds, squally at times through much of the south. Anywhere as far north as the southern pastoral districts are looking at the potential of a few of those showers. But there could also be some raised dust through parts of South Australia, northern Victoria and into the western parts of New South Wales. All three of those states are looking at very strong and gusty winds developing. Quite warm though through Queensland, particularly into the southeastern corner, and it'll be wet about the north and west of Tasmania. But for the southeast corner, very little in the way of rainfall going that far. And we're not expecting to see as significant winds. We will see that wind freshening a little, but certainly not the damaging strength that we're expecting across much of the southeast. But clear conditions across the north, and that will continue as this high pressure system continues to ridge across the northern 2/3 of the continent. Still got the potential of a shower about parts of the west and south coast of WA though. Still very strong winds through Victoria, New South Wales. This is when we see the coldest of the air move through, so snow dropping down to about the 600-700 metre level. For South Australia, conditions gradually easing as the day progresses as this high pressure system ridges through, but we are still looking at cool conditions across most southeast centres.
Here are the top stories on ABC News. Victoria will enter a snap 5-day lockdown as case numbers climb across the state. Another 2 cases have been confirmed, bringing the state's total to 18. One of the cases is from the MCG cluster, while the other is a close contact of a resident at an apartment complex. Rules for the lockdown will be the same as the one Victoria had a few weeks ago. New South Wales has recorded 65 new local infections. Up to 36 cases were in the community while infectious. There are currently 73 people in hospital being treated for the virus. 19 cases are in intensive care. 5 of them are on ventilators. The Prime Minister is proposing changes to how much support the federal government hands out to areas in lockdown. Under the plan, up to $600 will be provided to people who lose their income once they've been locked down for a week, and there will be no asset test. Scott Morrison says he'll take the proposal and ideas for business support to National Cabinet tomorrow. And Tasmanian author Amanda Lowry has won the nation's most prestigious literary prize, the Miles Franklin Award. The novelist won the $60,000 prize for her 8th book, The Labyrinth, which took 5 years to write. She is the second Tasmanian to win the award after 2-time winner Christopher Koch. Original Victoria